Hello guys, David Vos here. Another beautiful day here in Alabama. Still kind of cloudy and cold. I guess that's what happens when winter comes. Well, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Friends, I've got some really detailed information. We did kind of do some preliminary information on Africa, but I believe that even after all that whole video, probably some of you thought, well, it still was left a little cloudy and we're not quite sure. We need a little bit more proof and a little better detail. I don't think I did that video well enough for everybody to follow along exactly. I don't think I had all the information in that video. You can't put it all into one video, but And I'm getting new information or thoughts as I pray and think about it, and I get sort of new points that go together with some of the points we already gave, and they confirm what we've been saying. But today, the Lord has shown me, literally today, a couple of things that I didn't know that really helps this whole situation. I want to start off by talking about Hagar, because I talk about that all the time when I say that was one of Abraham's wives. I think maybe we all do when we're reading that. We're thinking, okay, Hagar, it says she was from Egypt. She was an Egyptian. She was a handmaid. And we think, well, okay, so Abraham had Sarah, Keturah, and Hagar. Now, it does mention that Hagar, she went east. Well, it didn't say she went to the Orient, right? We don't know where she really went. She went east, but she didn't go to the Orient. We know that because she was wandering around with Ishmael. They might have started off, if they're walking, they went east 50 miles, but their people migrated all the way east. That's possible that Bible is so written that when it says somebody went to the east and they only went 50 miles east, but later on their tribe would be all the way to the Orient. So we can't rule that out, that they didn't. Somebody went east. Somebody went to China. Somebody went to Japan. Of course, we know now that Dan, and we're going to find out really who Dan is here. That's what I'm trying to put together, is that I don't think people understand that these 12 tribes are not from just Rachel and Leah. They're also from some concubines, Zilpah, I think, and Bilhah. We're not really aware of the fact that all of these different mothers, Rachel, Leah, Zilpah, Bilhah, they were concubines. So it's very likely that some of them were, various tribes or nations or races. We're not going to say what race at this point, but what we need to do is understand that there's a bunch of different tribes here. They all had different colors. And not all of them had the same destinies. We got the chapter there in Genesis 49 where Jacob blesses them and each of them get different blessings. And Moses does the same thing. So then what we brought up in the other video we did the other day about Africa was we brought up the idea that maybe Leah wasn't even really the full-blooded sister of Rachel. Now, the first clue we get is that Rachel has the word L in it, and that the ch might not even have been there because the dictionary says it's really originally Rahel and has something to do with the divine being Ra, right? And we've got Israel and Solomon, lots of words with a lot of Egyptian deities in it, but we just ignore all that. So then Leah is obviously a woman, a covenant of Abraham, a marriage covenant that represents the covenant of the lower carnal commandments, the deity of Yahweh. And of course, Rachel would be the deity El. And we've also recently kind of pigeonholed these words in such a way that we're a little more clear on the exact identity of El. El is Enlil. Sometimes it's spelled Hillel. And so we've got, in our Bible, unbeknownst to us, we've got this Yahweh of the Elohim. We've got Elohim's plural. We know from the Sumerian and the Egyptian and the Akkadian and the Babylonian that Elohim really is plural, that there was a bunch of deities running around. And they all had some part in creating the world. We also know about this Enkidu, the wild man, who, is juxtaposed with Gilgamesh. Now, sometimes G's are silent. It's probably Ilamesh. Ilam is probably Hillel. And Enki is Enki-Iyah. And so Enkidu is the wild man. He's got 2 horns. Looks like the devil. And we talked about how angels is really an angelicized way of saying An-El or Enlil. And so why is it that the mountain of El has all these sons of the Elohim? Well, because the sons of the Elohim are the sons of Enlil, even though the High Father is Uranus or Anu in the Sumerian. But there were these 2 sons. One was a heavenly deity, Enlil, from the sky, like Zeus with his thunderbolt. And the other one took up his residence down there in the abyss and then moved it up on land. And that was the god over the abyss, which is, Poseidon. Some say Hades, but there were these 3 deities. And Poseidon and Hades had their kingdoms in a place not in heaven, but Poseidon had his kingdom in the ocean. And Hades had his kingdom in the deep abyss, in Tartarus and hell. Hades is another word for hell. So, but going back to Hagar, we've quoted this before, where Paul says that the Jerusalem that is now corresponds to Hagar, who is in bondage with her children. And she corresponds to a mountain in Arabia. Okay, so she didn't go very far east, or Hagar didn't. He wandered around with 1 bottle of milk, right, with this child called Ishmael. And Ishmael ends up having 12 children. So there's 12 tribes of Ishmael. It's kind of a counterpart to Jacob with his 12 tribes. And Paul says this is the 12 tribes that is present. Interestingly enough, the Jerusalem that then was, when Paul was looking at it and saying the Jerusalem that is now, is Hagar, is literally called, the temple there was called the Temple of Herod. Herod or Herodias, or, this word, Herod, has to do with Edomians, and that is Esau. Now, Esau is not Ishmael, no, but the story tells you that Hagar went and wandered around, and Ishmael was like 13 or something. He was a young man. They found Esau, and they intermarried. Esau and Ishmael intermarried, and they become this whole nation down there that the Israelites are always confronting. But there's another nation that seems to have joined up with them, and that's Keturah, because Keturah ends up becoming the mother of this group called the Midianites. And this is where Jethro was a prophet or a great priest or something that Moses went to, was a Midianite priest. So now that's interesting. The whole Aaronic priesthood came from Moses, right? Of the tribe of Levi. Moses was a Levite, and his brother Aaron. So Moses is he's the one who meets Yahweh and creates the commandments. The whole religion of Judaism came from Moses, but no. The whole religion of Judaism came from Jethro, a Midianite, from Keturah. That's what the Bible says, but we just don't pay any attention to any of this. Jethro was above Moses, and Moses got the priesthood simply because he married the daughter of Jethro, or Zipporah. And they ended up having a son that ended up being Balaam, and Balaam gives a big prophecy in the Bible. So there was this whole priesthood. But what happened was Jethro and Moses, after they made this confederation, they brought these people up out of Egypt, whoever they were, right? They were the sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes. Well, he brings them up out of there, and they decide to make a lower priesthood out of Moses. Moses' brother Aaron, and they call them the Aaronites, or the Levitical priesthood. And so this was made up right on the spot. It wasn't an ancient priesthood. It was an appendage to the original priesthood of Jethro, who was also called Ruel, because they worshipped El, by the way. Right? There was no Yahweh in there. But El then is a deity that was worshipped by all the Middle Eastern individuals and Canaanites and so forth. So, but Keturah then was the mother of this Midianite thing. Now we find out through the Old Testament that the Midianites, the Ishmaelites, and the children of Esau were all one nation, and they all worshipped at Mount Seir in Arabia. So it's interesting that Paul, it says then that that this bondage that we're in the world is because of a covenant. Just like we said that Jacob had a covenant with Leah and Rachel. There's two covenants. And his favorite covenant was Rachel. But she was barren, and Leah ended up having all these kids, 6 children and a daughter. And we're going to go through those children to find out who they really were. Now we're going to cover some genealogies. It may be a little tedious, but I'll try to do this as clear and concise as I can so that you can follow along. But we're going to be tracing a lineage back from Shem to Heber to Joktan. You've got Noah and Shem, and there's 2 kids named Peleg and Joktan. They were the sons of Eber, or the Hebrews, some say. So the Hebrews have these 2 kids, Joktan and Peleg. Now it says that it's kind of interesting. Peleg, the word L-E-G, leg, like in English. It says because in his days the earth was divided. That's probably the days of Babylon, right, when they confused their languages. So in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided, and the 72 left Babylon. So all the nations of the world, doesn't matter. There weren't black people in Africa. There weren't white people in Europe. It wasn't like that. All the nations were all together at Babylon in the days of Peleg. And Peleg had a brother named Joktan. So we might assume they were both the same color. He came from the same daddy, right? Well, they might have had different mothers. All 72 nations were there. Were they all different colors? I don't know. It doesn't seem a lot, really reasonable, but there might be a reason for that. We could go back to some things that Thoth did in Atlantis that could have caused nations and tribes and things like this. Because when Thoth came down on the earth and saw all this barbarianism after the flood, it seems like he went to each and every place in the world and set up religious worship and gave them some distinction, did something with their consciousness or whatever, their learning. We don't know whether he made specifically. Some say but that there's some indication that originally Jesus made each and every tribe. Well, this has got to be somehow symbolic, but we all know that we're from different tribes. We have different characteristics, and we're, we belong to a house. There's 12 houses. And I believe in the end, all of the world comes from the 12 houses. So they came up out of Egypt. But it's like there's always 2 tribes. There's always Cain and Seth. Or I should say Cain and Abel or whatever, and then Cain and Seth. And then you come down to Jacob and Esau and, and Ham and Shem and all these different, there's always these dualities. All the way down, Judah has 2 kids, Zerah and Pharez. And you got to pay careful attention to who these people are. We can't just say, oh, there's 12 tribes from Jacob, therefore they're all the same tribe. Because Jacob had a whole bunch of different wives. There's got to be some significance. Some of them were concubines, most of them. So, what we'll find out is that Keturah, when she has her firstborn son from Abraham, she calls that child Joktan. Well, that's interesting, the way the writers would put names to help us identify who their ancestors were. So, Sarah came from Laban's house, And remember, Abraham and Nahor were brothers, and their father was Terah, who lived 205 years. So remember also Lot in the Bible, Lot and his two daughters. The wife looked back and turned the pillar of salt. Well, Lot was also Abraham's nephew. So he was also a child of Nahor. And so Nahor and Abraham were very close. They were brothers. Sometimes we think, well, these are two different tribes. No, they were brothers. At that point, they didn't have tribes. They're just brothers. And so Lot was his son, and that was his nephew, Lot. And so he was very protective of. These were already family, or brothers, or family. So all the people from Nahor and all the people from Abraham, all their tribes, as they went down, had some affinity, some camaraderie. They were family. And so Abraham protected Lot. But who was Keturah? Well, Keturah names her firstborn son Joktan. Well, I read you guys that little thing the other day that shows that somehow or another, Joktan, for whatever reason, because we don't have every detailed chronology in the world, but we have enough to figure this out. We know that Joktan's child was Sheba. There is a couple of Shebas in the Bible. We can prove that this is the Sheba that, according to the history books, ends up in Africa. Not just, people say, oh, down there in Ethiopia. I mean, they got whole traditions and tribes and religious ceremonies. And they acting out this whole Ark of the Covenant thing. History books say they had the Ark of the Covenant. There's gobs of history books that tell about Solomon having the Queen of Sheba come and visit him, and they have a child, and she goes back to Ethiopia, which is the name for Africa. The east side of Africa was sometimes called Abyssinia. That's the abyss, that we were talking about the other day. It's the kingdom where Enki went down and set up his kingdom. Or Ham, who was Saturn, who was a lineal descendant of Enki, and we explained that the other day, who is Cain. But Ham did something bad. Ham slept with his father's concubine, Naamah, who was a lineal descendant of Cain. So these individuals down there in Africa, some of them were, obviously, they were from Ham. And we know that there were several of these children of Ham. Then there was one who was specifically, remember, Ham had his own wife. The Bible doesn't say there was any curse on the other kids of Ham. But on the one kid, Canaan, it says, cursed be Canaan. Not cursed be Ham. But cursed be Canaan. Why? Because it was the child of this union between Ham, who saw his father's nakedness. This is a sexual thing. The idiom there is something that he saw his father's nakedness, means he slept with his father's concubine, which was Naamah, who is the great-great-granddaughter of Cain. So Cain gets through by the union of Ham and Naamah, and their child is this Canaan. And Canaan has 7 nations, and that's the 7-headed dragon of the dragon mother, Naamah. We've talked about that. So, but Joktan has a child. So we don't know who Joktan was. We don't know what color he was. Doesn't say what color he was. But we do know that that's the Joktan that has a child named Sheba. David ends up having Bathsheba, who produces Solomon. Wow. It's very important we understand who Bathsheba is, right? And then right after that, Solomon, for some reason, the Queen of Sheba now is very interested in Solomon. Why? Well, maybe it's because Solomon is like either, a grandson or, this is her kingdom by virtue of her being the queen. Okay? David was the king and Bathsheba was the mommy. And we will show that where this Sheba is from Joktan is not just some kingdom. This was probably the greatest kingdom in the world. Probably much bigger than Israel as we know it, or Babylon or Rome or anything else, is because this place was later called Meroe. And Herodotus talks about Meroe, which was a great pyramid. He said it was bigger than the one at Giza. Quite a bit bigger, because there was a lake, a big lake, was deep, and the pyramid went under the lake some meters. I don't know if he gives the feet, the number of feet or meters it goes down below the water. But above the water line, it was bigger. I think, as I'm remembering now from memory, I do know that the pyramid was bigger than the one in Giza. I don't remember if it was bigger from the water level up to the top, or if it was just bigger from the pinnacle all the way down to its base, which is below the water. I don't remember, but it was a very large pyramid, bigger than the one at Giza. And there was a group of pyramids there. It was a huge city, a metropolis, that is now no longer there. Herodotus writes about it, and underneath of it was called the labyrinth. Now, the labyrinth is very important and was important in ancient times, but we don't talk about it today. But that is where there were all these libraries. Later on, they were moved to Heliopolis, which, really wasn't that far from there. I mean, I think it was like 50 miles, and you go to present-day Cairo. And now there's another temple there, the biggest one that we know probably still stands from the days of before the flood. Well, the one that down there at Meroe was probably also from before the flood. It was very huge. And this thing called the labyrinth, I believe, is where all the ancient wisdom and history has been stored. Now, it's either still there, under the ground, being guarded by someone, or the entrances have been blocked and nobody knows where it's at. I doubt that, because Alexander the Great went down there and everybody else, and they looked everywhere. They wanted all the gold. It was like probably gold and jewels and history books and vast amounts of wealth under the ground there at the labyrinth. But it was either blocked off and it's still down there, or they got all of it out, the priests and stuff did, before it was ransacked, or maybe there's tunnels going from there to other places. I believe it is still there. I mean, it is somewhere in the world. It's preserved. Now, some of it could have been taken other places. And here is another part we don't know for sure, but this Joktan is also purported to be that Yucatan Peninsula, like Mexico, It's called the Yucatan. That's Joktan. So, yeah, the African people were the firstborn son of Solomon. And his name was Menelik. And we've got lots of stories that this is where the reigning king of King David, the line of Solomon and King David, went to Africa. And then perhaps at some point they went to Mexico. But we won't get into that probably today, but that's another thing, that there's definitely some connection between the gold of Ophir and Peru, which has these big gold mines, and Africa has these big gold mines. And the Bible talks about the gold of Havilah, which was good, and Ophir was in that area. So we don't know exactly where Havilah is, but most people think it was down there in Africa, where the gold was good. But back to what we were saying, you see, Joktan is a son of Shem, but this lady that is a descendant of Joktan is, one of his children is Sheba. And Sheba, we know, was a black woman, because it says in the Canticles, the Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes and stuff, it describes her. Well, we know that it's describing the Queen of Sheba, because we've got church fathers that in their day, they had knowledge that this was the Queen of Sheba in the Canticles. And they claim she was a black woman. And I'll show you evidence of that. So we have then some indication by others that say, well, there's another Joktan. And this Joktan was an Arabian type person. Not a black woman, not from Africa. This Joktan was the down in Yemen. Well, Yemen is the furthest place south in Saudi Arabia. And the word Sheba means south. That's what it means. The Queen of the South was another title she has, the Queen of the South. That means the farthest south. There are scriptures that say it's the farthest extremity in the remotest regions of the south. Well, that might be why they called Yemen Sheba then, because it just means the south of Saudi Arabia. But the south is down in Africa, the real great Sheba and the Queen of Sheba, and we know it was a vast kingdom. And we know where it was. It was Meru. It was in Africa. So, but now here's what I wanted to get to. So you're hearing Paul say that Hagar was a slave, and you think, oh, well then she must be black. No. It says that Hagar was an Egyptian. You know, Abraham married an Egyptian concubine. Okay, she was a slave. She was a concubine. Well, concubine didn't necessarily mean that your whole race was a slave. You could have white concubines. In fact, Bilhah and Zilpah were white, and they were concubines. We know they were white because there's a book called the Book of Naphtali that some of it's missing, but we can still read it pretty good. And Naphtali, of course, was a brother of Dan from the same concubine, Bilhah. And he writes in his book, that the Book of Naphtali, that his mother Bilhah was identical to Rachel from Laban's, and that they were sisters. That was literally a person that was so much like Rachel that they were of the same race, they looked the same, and they were identical. And he says that Bilhah's came from Rothius. And there's a whole story about that. So we know who Bilhah is, and Bilhah brought forth Dan and Naphtali, which is interesting because Dan and Naphtali are up over there in the Mongolian area. Remember, we saw that video that we did the other day, and it shows that the tribe of Dan and Naphtali were always together. Why? Because they were literally the same exact race, because they were from the same mother and the same father. There were two different children, but from the same mother and father, so they stuck together. And they went to Turkey, and they went to Russia and Europe, and all the way up to Mongolia and back to Europe. And their last place we know where they were, where they took up their dominion and began to rule, and they stayed, was Transylvania, Norway, and the Germanic tribes, and the Muscovites too, the Ukraine area. But so we know that not everybody who's a slave is necessarily just black. You know, they had brown slaves, they had white slaves, they had black slaves. But we do tend to think in terms of the black race as slaves, regardless of whether that was ever true or not. Certainly today, we're familiar with the fact that they brought many of the people from Africa to America and made them slaves. So that exacerbates this whole scenario. But what I want to share with you is that actually Hagar wasn't from Ethiopia, or Hagar wasn't from Africa. She was from Egypt. And I don't mean the country of Egypt, because that could have been any number of different races from time to time. Whenever somebody would move in or move out, you know, we got the Hyksos, and we don't know who they were, and that's all. So it's very controversial. But I want to show you here that Egypt was a brother of Danis, and Danis was the son of Judah. Yeah. Right here in this little thing that we read the other day, that purchase his pilgrimage, that we covered on that video about Africa. And notice right here it says, the name Egyptus is derived from Egyptus, brother of Danis, after the common account, as others say, of Ai and Copti. Remember, the Coptics were Egyptians, and they have a Christianity that's older than the Christianity that we've ever heard of. There was a number of Christians that hailed from the Coptic Egyptian area. So he's describing this country of Egypt, and he's saying that the word Egypt came from Judah's son, Egypt, and Danius. And as we've said too, Danius was the son of Zerah, a son of Judah. So Egyptus was evidently another son of Zerah. So would be of the true tribe of Judah. So when we're talking about Hagar then being an Egyptian, we're definitely not saying she was black. We were saying she's from Egypt, from Judah. Okay, but we want to find out actually who Judah is from, because Judah is not from Rachel, Judah is from Leah. And what we're going to show in this video today is that Rachel was from Laban, and Laban was from Terah. So, let me read you a couple of things here. First, in the Wikipedia, the Queen of Sheba. Who is this? The Queen of Sheba, okay, is a figure that is first mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. In the original story, she brings a caravan of valuable gifts for the Israelite King Solomon. This account was undergone extensive Jewish, Islamic, and Yemenite and Ethiopian elaborations. Well, they like to call them elaborations, probably because some of them were. I believe the Judeans have proved beyond a doubt that they do a lot of elaborations. But the true original accounts that we can confirm from the church fathers and historians do not always agree with these Talmudic Judeans. So we go down here. There's a painting of the 17th century AD painting of the Queen of Sheba from the Church of Lalibela, Ethiopia, and now in the National Museum of Ethiopia in Addis Ababa. The most extensive version of the legend appears in the Kibra Nagas, the Glory of the Kings, the Ethiopian national saga, translated from the Arabic in 1322. Here, Menelik is a child of Solomon, and Makeda, the Ethiopic name for the Queen of Sheba. She is the child of the man who destroys the legendary Snake King Arwi, from whom the Ethiopian dynasty claims descent to the present day. While the Abyssinian story offers much greater detail, that's the other eastern half of Africa, it omits any mention of the queen's hairy legs or any other element of the might reflect on her unfavorably. Based on the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, the Queen of the South is claimed to be the Queen of Ethiopia. In those times, King Solomon sought merchants from all over the world in order to buy materials for the building of the temple. Among them was Tamrin, great merchant of Queen Makeda of Ethiopia. Having returned to Ethiopia, Tamrin told the queen of the wonderful things he had seen in Jerusalem and of Solomon's wisdom and generosity, whereupon she decided to visit Solomon. She was warmly welcomed, given a palace for dwelling, and received great gifts every day. Solomon and Makeda, which is Queen of Sheba, spoke with great wisdom, and instructed by him, she converted to Judaism. Well, I don't think they called it Judaism. We're going to find out exactly what it was here in a little bit. Before she left, there was a great feast in the king's palace. Makeda stayed in the palace overnight after Solomon had sworn that he would not do her any harm, while she swore in return that she would not steal from him. As the meals had been spicy, Makeda awoke thirsty at night and went to drink some water. When Solomon appeared, reminding her of her oath, she answered, "Ignore your oath, just let me drink water." That same night, Solomon had a dream about the sun rising over Israel. But, being mistreated and despised by the Judeans, the sun moved to shine over Ethiopia and Rome. Well, Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba, Makeda, a ring as a token of faith, and then she left. On her way home, she gave birth to a son, whom she named Ben-Halakim. Ben-Halakim. There's that Lakim, or, like Molech or something, I don't know. Son of the wise man, later called Menelik. Melech? I don't know. After the boy had grown up in Ethiopia, he went to Jerusalem carrying the ring and was received with great honors. The king and the people tried in vain to persuade him to stay. Solomon gathered his nobles and announced that he would send his firstborn son to Ethiopia. Together with their firstborns, he added that he was expecting a third son, who would marry the king of Rome's daughter and reign over Rome, so that the entire world would be ruled by David's descendants. So this is saying that the firstborn son was this Menelik, and he would rule over Africa. And then he was going to have another kid with her, and they were going to rule over Rome because of this vision that they had. So the entire world would be ruled by David's descendants. Then Bena Lekim was anointed king by Zadok, the high priest. That's a king priest. And he took the name David. The firstborn nobles who followed him are named, and even today, some Ethiopian families claim their ancestry from them. Prior to leaving, the priest's son had stolen the Ark of the Covenant. Oh, there's a lot of information that says the Ark of the Covenant went down there. And after their leader, Azarias, offered a sacrifice as commanded by one of the El's angels, with much wailing, the procession left Jerusalem on a wind cart led and carried by the archangel Michael. Having arrived at the Red Sea, Azarias revealed to the people that the ark is with them. And David prayed to the ark, not King David, but a descendant of David that went with the Queen of Sheba. David prayed to the ark, and the people rejoiced, singing, dancing, blowing horns and flutes, and beating drums. The ark showed its miraculous power during the crossing of the stormy sea, and all arrived unscathed. When Solomon learned that the ark had been stolen, he sent a horseman after the thieves and even gave chase himself, but neither could catch them. Guys, this story is not just some story they found written in a book somewhere only that Ethiopians know about. Scholars have said for years that the Ark of the Covenant's in Africa. The Ethiopians have had this tradition for many years. Church fathers have talked about it. Historians, this is all real. Solomon returned to Jerusalem and gave orders to the priests to remain silent about the theft and to place a copy of the ark in the temple so that the foreign nations could not say that Israel had lost its fame. According to some sources, Queen Makeda was part of the dynasty founded by Zabesi and Gabo in 1370. The family's intended choice to rule Aksum was Makeda's brother, Prince Norad, but his early death led to her succession to the throne. She apparently ruled the Ethiopian kingdom for more than 50 years. The official chronicle of the Ethiopian monarchy from 1922 claims that Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, reigned from 1013 to 982 BC. That's when Solomon was alive too, same time, with dates following the Ethiopian calendar. In the Ethiopian book of Aksum, Makeda is described as establishing a new capital city at Aziba. Now hold on, we're going to get to this, but just think about this for a second. This is an entire nation of people down there in Ethiopia that have rights, they have a religion, they have a priesthood, they trace their genealogy back to Solomon and David. And we're going to go, oh, we don't believe in that. We'll just believe in the Judeans who have no proof, who just, some oral tradition think, well, we don't know, but we don't think they're right. We refuse to believe it. Well, some of the rabbis do believe it, of course, and this is why many of the Ethiopians are going to Israel today, and they'll be considered children of Israel, because they know they cannot deny this history. But let me go on. So they had a capital city at Aziba. Edward Ullendorf holds that Makeda, which is the Queen of Sheba, is a corruption of Candace, the name or title of several Ethiopian queens from Meroe or Seba. Candace was the name of that queen of the Ethiopians whose chamberlain was converted to Christianity under the preaching of Philip the Evangelist. In Acts chapter 8, verse 27, in 30 AD, in the 14th century, Ethiopic version of the Alexander romance, Alexander the Great of Macedonia, is said to have met a queen, Candac, or Candace of Nubia. Historians believe that the Solomonic dynasty actually began in 1270 with the emperor Yekuna Amlak, There's that Amalek, that's in the Bible, that was Menelek, because Zadok, the Zadokite priest from Melchizedek, anointed him as king, the son of Solomon, the son of David, who, with the support of the Ethiopian church, overthrew the Zagwe dynasty, which had ruled Ethiopia since sometime during the 10th century. The link to King Solomon provided a strong foundation for Ethiopian national unity. Ethiopians see their country as the Divine One's chosen country, the final resting place that he chose for the ark, and Sheba and her son were the means by which it came there. Despite the fact that the dynasty officially ended in 1769 with Emperor Yoas, Ethiopian rulers continued to trace their connection to it right up to the last 20th century emperor Haile Selassie. Guys, this is crazy. We have all the information right here, but nobody wants to believe it. But you see, what I wanted to show you here also was that this the Sheba, or the city of Sheba, was Meroe, which is where that big, huge pyramid was built that Herodotus talks about, that was a greater city, a bigger metropolis, huge, vast labyrinth, which I believe housed all the ancient wisdom of Atlantis. All the history of mankind was down there. And one day we'll recover it. But let me show you something else. Keturah. Sheba, a son of Joktan, brother of Peleg. He is a descendant of Shem and therefore a Shemite. Sheba's descendants are called Sabaeans. So you see, Keturah was a woman of the line of Joktan, and Sheba is a son of Joktan. This is the land down in Africa. It eventually went to Africa and became the Sabaeans, and their queen was the queen of Sheba, and this is the great mother of, well, David married Bathsheba, and they had a child named Solomon. So if Bathsheba was black, as all historians and church fathers say, then Solomon was probably half black. But let me show you something else here. Here it says, in the Mir-at Etz Zeman, it is stated, Ibn el-Kelbi says, Yuktan, the Arabic equivalent of Joktan, is the same as Katan, son of Aber, or Eber in the Bible. And so, say, the generality of the Arabs, el-Beladiri says, people differ respecting Katan. Some say he is the same as Yuktan, who is mentioned in the Pentateuch, but the Arabs Arabicized his name and said Katan, the son of Had, because their identity, their prophet Hud, with Eber, whom they call Aber, and some say of Es Semayafa, or as is said in one place by the author here quoted, El Himayesa, the son of Nebit, or Nabioth, the son of Ishmael. He then proceeds to continuation of the former passage. Abi Hanif Ed Dinawari says he is Katan, the son of Aber. So, and then here it says that Joktan is the progenitor of the Mongoloid race, including East Asians and the indigenous peoples of the Americas with the Yucatan Peninsula, supposedly being named after Joktan. The early proponent of his theory was the theologian Benito Arias Montano, who proposed a link between the names of Ophir, Joktan's son, and Peru. Peru, possible. But going back to Genesis 10:25, it says, 2 sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg because of in his time the earth was divided. His brother was named Joktan. So I want to read you in Genesis chapter 29 about Jacob marrying the 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, because there's some interesting things we need to look at here. Now, it does tell you that Rachel was the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother. Because remember, this is Jacob, who is the son of Isaac, and Rebekah. And Rebekah was also from Laban's house. So we know that Rebekah was a descendant of Laban. And so Jacob is looking at this Rachel, and she says, it's the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. So she ran and told her father. Then it came to pass when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. So he told Laban all these things, and Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him for a month. Well, that's interesting too. I don't think I've ever noticed that. I was just reading this a little bit ago, but I didn't notice it says bone and my flesh. Remember when Jesus said, touch me, for a spirit doth not have flesh and bones, as you see that I do. But he never mentioned blood. And I've always said that's pretty much the only time in the Bible that I knew of that it mentions flesh and bone and disregards the blood. Well, here's another case. So, bone and flesh is a little different than you are my blood, right? You are my blood. You're my flesh and bone. Usually it's my flesh and blood. So I don't know. There may be significance there. He stayed with him for a month. And so then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should be your wages? Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Now Jacob loved Rachel. So he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your daughter, your younger daughter. And Laban said, oh, it's better that I give her to you than I should give her to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob served for 7 years for Rachel. And then they seemed only like a few days because he was in love with her. And Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. Now it came to pass in the evening, he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to Jacob, not Rachel. And he went into her. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this you have done with me? Was it not for Rachel that I served with you? Why then have you deceived me? Well, I don't know what happened there in the middle of the dark. It must have been really dark in that tent, because I guess it was just all dark, no starlight or moonlight that night. And they had this tent, and they said, okay, Jacob, go in the tent, turn all the lights off. We're sending in Rachel. And you're like, here comes Leah. She must have known she was tricking him, right? She knew that for 7 years he'd been working for Rachel, right? So she tips those in, and he doesn't notice nothing. And he sleeps with her and conceives a child. In the morning he looks up and he goes, what? I'm sleeping with her, Leah, and I was supposed to be sleeping with Rachel. So all night long he was just making love to this woman he thought was somebody else. This is kind of strange, but of course, this is a story. So it says, and Laban said, it must not be done so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Yeah, but it shouldn't be done in your country to lie to somebody either. Fulfill her week, and we will give you this one also for the service which you will serve with me still another 7 years. I would have said, yeah, right. Give me Rachel and that girl. That was your fault. I'm leaving, right? But of course, the Lord had a plan. So Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. The week. There's another expression where we could see a parallel. Because in the Bible it says there were 70 weeks. And people say, oh, it was weeks of years. Well, here's another example of that. He didn't just slave for 1 week. He slaved for a week of years, 7 years. So he gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife also. And Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a maid. Boy, these guys had it great back in those days, if you're a man, right? You just walk up to somebody, hey, sir, I got some sheep out here and some goats. Will that work? Oh, yeah, you got sheep and goats and you're good. You're a rich man. Oh, well, I'll take all your wives, not just that one, right? I like that one. She's cute. But how about you just give them all to me, right? And they're all their handmaids. I'll have a bunch of slaves, too. Oh, yeah, we'll just make some slaves and give them to you. You'll have like 14 women you can sleep with, whichever one you want on any given night, right? And have all these different tribes and become a great man. These great kings came about by the sleeping of women and arranging genealogical tribes from different women and who they were. So, I don't know. It's crazy to me that this kind of thing was being carried on. And I'll tell you another thing. The Bible says that a man shall not lie down with a man as he will lie down with a woman in the Old Testament. I mean, it specifically says a man. Now, he's not talking about mankind, right? Any human. He's talking about male. A male human shall not lie down with a other male human the way he would lie down with a female. In other words, I guess if you were sleeping in the same bunk one night, you're out, you're a soldier in the army and you're all laying in the same bunker, well, that doesn't count as lying with somebody. But you can't lie with a man the same way you'd lie with a woman. Well, how do you lie with a woman? I guess that means you have sex. But it never says that a woman shall not lie down with another woman. Never. Not in the Old Testament. You know why? Because these men were not all of the purest kind. I mean, they couldn't be if they're out running around taking many wives and all these concubines. I guarantee that it never crossed one of these guys' minds that, well, hey, since you're all here in my bed, just saying. There's no law against lesbianism in the Old Testament. Nowhere. But of course, we're not under any law in the New Testament. But just throwing that out there, that's just a strange little piece of information. But goes on here, it says, when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb. Well, you see, if Leah was the bad lady, right, because Rachel's the one that was his favorite, and she's got the new covenant with El, right, and Leah's Leah, that's the bad covenant. But somebody loved Leah. I wonder who it was. Was it Yahweh or was it Enlil? I don't know, but somebody loved her because she was unloved. Why? There are just always these strange, spasms of compassion and love from this divine being sometimes. And then here and there, he's got this anger problem. Well, we'll show you here in a minute that there's actually two deities being presented here, right? Two of them. They have two different dispositions. But it says that Rachel was barren. And usually they say that when a woman's barren in the Bible, it's usually because they did something wrong or they weren't loved by the Lord, or the Lord opens their womb or the Lord closes it for whatever reason, fate. Well, this is obviously fate because her child ends up being, when the Lord opens her womb, her child becomes Joseph, who gets the promise that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's handed on to Joseph. No other tribe, not to Judah, not to anyone else. So, Leah conceived to bear a son. She called his name Reuben. Now, Reuben's the firstborn. But we'll find out later on that Reuben doesn't get the birthright. Number one, probably because it's not from Rachel, it's from Leah. And the Lord has in mind that the one's going to get the birthright's going to be from Rachel. Here, as much as he loved Leah and he had compassion for her, she ends up having 6 of these kids. And she's the one that's the mother of Dinah, too. So the Lord blessed her. And her kid, Judah, ends up being king, right? But only until he who comes as a legal right, which is Joseph. To him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So Leah conceived and bore a son. She calls his name Reuben. For she said, the Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. She then conceived again and bore a son. What kind of a love arrangement was this? My husband doesn't love me, but if I give him a child, maybe he'll love me. That's not love. These people were our ancient patriarchs. They didn't know what love was. They couldn't just love somebody for who they were, right? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's just the way it's written. But I had these questions. So the Lord has heard that I am unloved. He has therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. So now she has two kids. She's got Reuben that loses his birthright because Reuben ends up sleeping with one of his mommies. It wasn't his mom, but, one of the concubines. So Reuben does a little bit like Ham, right? And that's why he loses his birthright, because Ham slept with his father's concubine. That's why it was a disgusting thing. And so now we got the same thing with Reuben. We'll cover that as we go. But Simeon then is another child of Leah. She conceived again, and she bore a son. Now this time my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore, his name was called Levi. So not only was Judah from Leah, which we'll see here in a minute, because she hasn't had Judah yet. That's her last, it's like her 4th kid or something. But the third one, let's see, no, this is the 4th one, Levi, right? Simeon, this time my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore, his name was Levi. So Levi's the 3rd kid. Now, Levi, of course, is the child that ends up being the priesthood. Very important child, because he's kind of in charge, because he's the high priest, or the priest, and they're doing a lot of, important functions amongst the tribes. But Judah becomes the one who's got the scepter, until he who comes as the legal right. So each of these tribes get different things, but Levi is very important. He's from Leah. Judah is also from Leah. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, now I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she stopped bearing. Okay, so at this point she stops bearing, and Judah is the 4th kid. So we got Levi, Simeon, Judah, and Reuben. Now, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, give me children or else I'll die. And she's having a tantrum. Give me children or else I'll die. Is she saying she's going to die of sadness, or I don't know. And so Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, and Jacob was mad. Oh, how dare you get upset that you don't have children? Well, his anger was roused. That doesn't sound, maybe you could have just said, and Jacob was disappointed, right? But no, he got angry against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of the divine one? Who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? So she answered, here is my maid Bilhah. Go in to her. She will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went in to her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, the divine one has judged my case. He has also heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. So, I'm pointing out something here. Dan's also given a big, prophecy about what he would do. And he's going to be the serpent in the path, an adder in the trail. And he's going to bite the horse's heel, and it will rear up, and the rider will fall backwards. And we've seen that is the heraldry on King Charles's coat of arms. But what I want to point out is that Dan was not from Leah or Rachel, but was from a concubine, which was Bilhah, who, as we've said, there's proof that she was of the same look, race, maybe, possibly, very likely also one of the daughters of Laban. Well, not an actual maternal daughter. They had somehow gotten sold into slavery, and he redeemed them. So they were slaves or concubines. Bilhah was a concubine. But there is a tradition that says she was exactly like Rachel, and she looked like Rachel. And this is why Rachel chose her, because she looked like her, and she wanted kids that looked like her. So Dan was also then, if Rachel was from Laban, Laban means white. The word Laban means white. If Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel were all from Laban, they were probably white women. Well, if Bilhah looked exactly like Rachel, then we have to assume, I don't know if we have to, but I think we can assume from the historical records that we know, they all say that Bilhah was also of the same race as Rachel. They were white. So Dan was also a child that they loved. It says, one of the things that it says about Dan is that he shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. We know that it was fulfilled in Samson, who was of the tribe of Dan, who was a great judge, kind of like a king. They called them judges. And he brought peace to the land and conquered the Philistines and so forth. But we also find that Dan ends up going up to the Mongolians and up to Turkey and becomes this great ruthless barbarian leader, this Germanic white race that turns bad and unmercifully kills people wherever he goes like barbarians. And we've talked about that. So it says, and Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. Now, Dan then and Naphtali were, first of all, Dan and Naphtali are brothers. Second of all, they both have the same mommy, Bilhah. And Bilhah looks like Rachel. So Rachel then kind of adopted Dan and Naphtali. Now, we saw in those pictures, that map, up there by Mongolia, up in Russia, that it shows the tribe of Dan was always with Naphtali. They went together. So then it says, when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, a troop comes. So she called his name Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed, and she called his name Asher. Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother, Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your mandrakes. Now, this is a little hard to understand, but it seems like what this is talking about is the fact that Rachel felt like she was barren and all she could think about is having a child. And if she could have a child, she wanted more kids, right? She's never really had her own kid. She's got Bilhah, her handmaid, that she was given by Leah. She's adopted Dan and Naphtali, but she wants her own kid. So what is this mandrake thing? Well, people say this is some kind of herb or something. It may be a type of herb that helps fertility. Okay? Whether this actually happened or whether it's just a story about she was barren, so she partook of some mandrakes and became more fertile, just as a way to explain how all of a sudden now she's fertile, I don't know. But what's also interesting is that in this story, Reuben ends up doing something naughty too and ends up losing his birthright. So there's something to this that we're not quite sure the exact, in-depth esoteric meaning of it in its entirety. I've gone into this before, but I think I'll skip that for now because we've got so many other things to cover here before we get through this. But it says that Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest, found the mandrakes in the field. So Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. I think she wants to be fertile, see. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? And would you take away my son's mandrakes also? See, remember, Reuben's the firstborn, but not of Rachel, of Leah. And Rachel is barren. So what are they really arguing about? The firstborn, the right of firstborn. And it's Reuben that's got the mandrakes. So there's got to be something to do. We said we wouldn't explain this, but you could just obviously see that there has something to do with the right of firstborn here. And Rachel wants to have a child. It will then replace Reuben. So maybe that's why Reuben lost his first right of firstborn, kind of like Esau selling it for a bowl of soup, right? He says, I'm so hungry, I'll do anything. All right, give me your right of firstborn and I'll give you the soup. Well, here, Leah's like, fine, I'll give you the mandrakes, right? And so she's like selling her own son, just so she could sleep with Jacob one more time. See, because Jacob was sleeping with Rachel or something. I don't know. So Rachel said, yeah, he'll come in and sleep with you tonight, but you give me the mandrakes, meaning that I'm the one that's going to be fertile and I'm going to have the next kid, or I don't know. So she got to sleep with him, but she traded that for the right of firstborn. Because if Rachel ever has a kid, then that's going to end up being the one that's blessed by Jacob, because that's his beloved wife, the real woman who would be the firstborn that should have been firstborn. Which is the way this always works, like Jacob and Esau and Cain and Abel. So, and Rachel said, therefore, he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrake. And the divine one listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, the divine one has given me my wages, because I have given my maid to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son, and Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him six sons. So she called his name Zebulun, and after that she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then the divine one remembered Rachel, I guess because she got the mandrakes, and he listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son, and said, the divine one has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So this goes on, and I don't know if we need to read any of this, but I wanted to show you where all these kids came from, and how 6 of these kids came from Leah, and Dinah came from Leah. And only 2 of the kids came from Rachel herself, and the other kids then came from concubines. So Dan then came from Bilhah, and all the evidence says that Dan looked a lot like Rachel and whatever race she was, and she was content to have this one, but then she did get her own kid, and that was Joseph. But we were talking about how sometimes this deity seems to have a temper, right? And other times he's got compassion and stuff like this. What's going on? Well, we're not being allowed to see who these deities are. It just says God most of the time. When in some cases it's Elohim, sometimes it's Yahweh Elohim, and sometimes it's just Ha'el, or the Enlil. Let me show you that right here, where it says in verse 12, we'll just say, and he said, lift up now thine eyes and see. This is King James Version. All the rams which leap upon the cattle are ring-stracked, speckled, and grizzled, for I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. So whoever this deity is that's helping out Jacob, right, because he's now withheld his wages and he switched women, he's just not being very fair with Jacob. And he wants to leave with his 2 wives, and he's telling Laban, give me my wages. So they make this deal that Jacob would get all the speckled sheep, and all the white ones would go to Laban. So, verse 13, it says, I am the deity of Bethel, where thou anointedest the pillar, and where thou vowed a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out of this land, and return to the land of thy kindred. So he's saying, okay, Jacob, I bless you. Now you're going back to the land of your kindred. But you see, I am not just any deity, not the Yahweh Elohim of the gods, but I'm one specific deity here. Let's see who that is. Well, first of all, we can just see it's the deity of Bethel. Bethel is the house of El. But let's take a look at the verse 13 there. And we'll go to the interlinear. And it says there, I am, where it says the, G-O-D, look up above 410. That is Ha-El, which is the El. That's Elel, or Enlil, in the Sumerian. So he says, I am Enlil of Bethel, or I am El of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar, where you made to me a vow. See, so this is a complete different vow or covenant that he made to a righteous deity who had compassion both on Leah and on Rachel, and was orchestrating the events here that would end up blessing all mankind. But yeah, that's not just all the Elohim that made that covenant with Jacob. It was just the deity of heaven, not that deity that's down below in the pit with the demons. Because Enkidu had a lot of Diablos, demons. But Enlil has the angels, or the An-Els. That's the anglicized way with the G in there, but it's An-El. Enlil. So I just thought I'd show that we really need to get a Bible that translate these words correctly. Anyway. Now, we don't have much time, but I want to show you this real quick. This is the record of the Testament of Naphtali, who, as we said, was also born of Bilhah, and so was Dan. Dan and Naphtali were both born from Bilhah, and so he gives his testimony. He says, "Hear the words of your father. I was born from Bilhah, and because Rachel dealt craftily and gave Bilhah in place of herself to Jacob, and she bore me upon Rachel's lap, therefore was I called Naphtali. And Rachel loved me because I was born upon her lap. And when I was a young and tender form, she was wont to kiss me and say, Would that I might see a brother of thine from mine own womb, like unto thee. Whence also Joseph was like unto me in all things, according to the prayers of Rachel." See, so Naphtali and Dan were from Bilhah, and they were exactly like Joseph, as it says here. "Now my mother was Bilhah, daughter of the Rothius, the brother of Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, and she was born of one and the selfsame day with Rachel." See, they were born on the same day, Rachel and Bilhah. So they were like sisters. "And Rothius was of the family of Abraham, a Chaldean, fearing divine, freeborn, and noble." So he was not a slave, he was freeborn and noble. So Dan then was probably white from Laban's house, a lot like Rachel, Rebekah, and Sarah. That's all I wanted to prove there. Now, we're just way over the allotted time for today, so I'm going to briefly sum this up, and we might have to do a little bit more on this, of course. We've got probably lots more to do on Africa, because it's a very interesting place, and there's some cities down there that we're going to show where Jerusalem may have been and stuff like this, and where they migrated and this kind of thing. But, and then we got that whole Yucatan thing over in Peru and all of that too, and the Mexicans and, the Mexico. But just to recap, there are a couple things. Keturah then was of Joktan, and Joktan, we can show, was the father of this person called Sheba, who made a kingdom in Ethiopia at Meroe in Egypt. It was probably the greatest kingdom in the world. And this is why the Bible talks about this great queen of Sheba that Solomon had a relationship with. So when we see one line in the Bible that gets all the praise, it's not always what you think. Because Judah, everybody's like, oh, Judah, Judah, Judah. Well, Judah is from Leah. They don't get the promise. They get the burden, right? They're the ones in bondage with their children. Not Ham, really, right? There was curses there, and there's curses with Dan, there's curses all over the place. But there's white people, like Dan, that went up and became ruthless barbarians. They're under they don't even get to be named amongst the children of Israel. And then we have this great kingdom from Joktan, which is the other child, not the Peleg, where it comes down to Heber and Abraham. Well, there's this other line that goes to Africa. What about them? Did you forget about them, Enlil and Anu? No, because you see, in due time, this is a big representation of the other side of the wedding. You've got the male line and the female line. The female line, just like with Cain, coming down to Naamah, and then Noah marries her. She gets through. Well, the Lord's always looking out for his people. So this people of Africa, they build this fantastic, they're blessed by the Lord. They build this huge, they've got the labyrinth and all the testimony of all the nations from Atlantis down there into the ground. And then Solomon marries them and makes this great union and unifies the southern and the northern kingdoms. When Solomon made the great kingdom, it's not talking about some little kingdom up there in what we call Palestine, about the size of New Hampshire. This was a vast kingdom that included Africa, Persia, Europe, all of this. Solomon had a grand kingdom. And It was a welding of these two, right? Children that are down in Africa, who are obviously black people, who are now wed to this great line from Haran up in Syria. So there's a lot we're going to go into. Not only did we find that out, but we also found out that Egyptus, in these chronologies of purchased his pilgrimage that we just read, it says that Egyptus is a child or a brother of Danis, which is the son of Zerah, the son of Judah. And this perfectly harmonizes everything that we know, because we also know that the Irish had to go and get a daughter from Egypt called Teotihi in order to make the divine king line up there in Ireland. So we're going to go ahead and leave it there for now. We're just so far over, we can't go any longer today. But we'll pick it up here maybe in the next video or the one after that. Not exactly sure how the Lord will lead us tomorrow. You know, whether we'll finish this tomorrow or very soon. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and go. Hope you have a wonderful day. May the Lord bless you guys. And we'll see you tomorrow.